The business of egg freezing, from bluster to best practice. This event has been made possible for PET to produce thanks to the support of University College London's EGA Institute for Women's Health, the British Fertility Society, the London Egg Bank, Cooper Surgical, University of Cambridge's ReproSoc and Reproduction and Fertility, an open access journal from the Society for Reproduction and Fertility. And the hashtag for the event is PetEgg. Now, egg freezing for social reasons or non-medical reasons, however we like to call this reproductive option, is the topic under the spotlight for this evening's discussion. And PET held its first event on this topic back in 2015. And at that time, the fertility figurehead, Professor Lord Robert Winston, was all across the media talking about this. And he told the Times that clinics charge handsomely for cryopreservation and are being highly exploitative. And he told Woman's Hour that the idea that you can store your eggs by freezing, I think, is a scam. Well, I have to respectfully disagree with Professor Lord Winston. Egg freezing is not a scam. It is a technology that works. But I agree with him that in a way that there's a risk that it could be exploitative and that the marketing and messaging could create unnecessary anxiety if you don't do it and create an unrealistic impression of success if you do. And it's something that's always given me quite a bit of cause for concern whenever we've done an event on this topic, that we're in somehow encouraging women to do it, which we're not. We're encouraging them to think about it, or saying this is an option. And I think that yet again, PET's message about a pinch of salt comes into play. And unlike with usual health advice about cutting salt, particularly as you get older, this is a case where as you get older, you may want to increase that pinch of salt, especially when it comes to understanding your chances of success. And we've been taking an interest in the various elements that this topic has thrown up over the years. And some of you will know that we've been campaigning to change the 10-year storage limit that there is in the UK if you freeze your eggs for non-medical reasons with our Extend the Limit campaign. And we've had some wins in that already, in that the government launched a public consultation, but we're still waiting for them to report on that. And we're waiting, and I'm hoping that some of them have tuned in this evening to say, yeah, and we're getting a bit impatient now for your response, for your findings on that consultation. And so if you haven't already signed the petition that we launched about this, I'd urge you to do so, and we'll post the link to that in the chat. So extending the time limit is just one issue, and it's an issue that well, she's really the poster girl of the campaign, Sharon Jones. She spoke at our event in Edinburgh in January last year about when she froze her eggs, and she told us about the lack of information that she was given about the procedure at that event. And I think we were all quite surprised about that she sort of came away not really knowing, not having, she felt sort of the pieces of paper to tell her what she'd done and what the next steps were. And we haven't got Sharon speaking this evening, but you can watch that short presentation that she gave. It's about 10 minutes, and we'll post the link to that in chat so you can watch it afterwards. So how do we ensure that women get the best information to decide whether this is the reproductive choice for them? Well, fortunately, I'm looking smug now. I'm not going to be answering that question or any others this evening, because we have 5 fabulous experts lined up for you. We have Rachel Cutting, Dr. Zeynep Gurtin, Dr. Lucy van der Wiel, Eileen Burbidge, and Professor Marcia Inhorn. Rachel is Director of Compliance and Information at the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the HFEA, the UK's regulator. and she's the former chair of the Association of Clinical Embryologists, which has now been subsumed into a new organisation, the Association of Reproductive and Clinical Scientists. But for many years before she joined the HFEA, Rachel was an embryologist.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening. It's a real delight to be involved in this event. So I suppose where I want to start is perhaps a little bit of the background about the HFEA, because I know many people that are listening tonight will be in licensed clinics and you will be involved with the HFEA to some degree. But for those that are perhaps joining and just to hear more about egg freezing, I thought I would just do a little background about what the HFEA is. So we're an arm's length body of the Department of Health, and we work independently on behalf of the government. We're a team of about 60 people, and we have various functions that we do. But mainly what we do is we license clinics. So we do that by a process of inspection, and we go into clinics before they open and then every 2 years to make sure that they are complying and working in a safe and legal and quality way. And then we grant a license, and that's up to 4 years. And that's one of our main statutory duties that we do. But what we also do is to help set standards. And what we do with that, we have a dedicated policy team who work to produce what's called a code of practice. And that's a document that clinics work to and gives them guidance about how they meet their legal requirements. And then just as a background, focusing more on egg freezing now, one thing that we've noticed over the last few years is that we have noticed a rising trend for egg freezing for both elective and medical reasons. And of course, an increased use of freezing, of using donor egg banks and using cryopreserved eggs for donor treatments. And probably that's due to an increased awareness of fertility preservation, due to the publicity, the support by large corporations, and a lot of marketing around that. But also, I think part of this, and I remember this as an embryologist, being excited about having new technology such as vitrification, which really changed, our perception of success with egg freezing, because all of a sudden we had a technique that we knew that was going to be more successful and survival rates. And I'm certain that that was played a big part in how egg freezing has become more available. And then reasons for egg freezing. Obviously, there's the medical reasons, patients who are dedicated, who have been diagnosed, unfortunately, with cancer and want to preserve their fertility for later on. But also what we're seeing is an increase in the proportion of elective egg freezing in cycles now. And that may be for women who want to preserve their fertility for social reasons. So what we've seen in the data that we collect is that the elective side of egg freezing is increasing, and that goes down gradually through clinical and then incidental for sort of, if a clinic has they don't produce enough sperm on the day, or there's a reason why we can't fertilize the eggs, and then for medical reasons and cancer. So some of the facts and figures, we've got a very good intelligence team at the HFEA who analyzes all the data that comes to us. And what we've noticed is, while IVF cycles have increased by 12% from 2013 to 2018, we've seen a huge jump, as you can see by the graph, in the number of patients having egg freezing. Although obviously compared to the 60,000 patients that are having IVF treatments, this is still a very small proportion, but it is a significant rise that we've seen, especially in the last few years. And the demographics of those patients are interesting to look at as well. As I said, it's still relatively low numbers, but also you can see that the majority of patients are between 35 and 37 when they have their eggs frozen. But it's actually quite interesting that that does spill over to the older ages as well. And we've got patients being reported back to us that are having frozen eggs in their 40, 43 and above, which I'll come on to the concerns about that later in the talk. The demographics that we usually see are women that are educated, professional, and in their late 30s and single. We know that a large proportion of patients that are coming through and having their egg freezing, and that's increasing. But what we need to look at as well is how many of those patients are returning to actually use those frozen eggs. And from HFEA data that we collect, we know that in the last, this is looking between 2010 and 2018, we know that there's been about 8,000 egg freeze cycles. The number of those patients that have returned to have those thawed is just over 3,000. So just over a third of patients have returned to use the eggs. And this is reflected in some of the literature as well. So there's various studies that are out there, and I'm sure they will be touched on later on by the other speakers. And we know that there generally is a low rate of utilisation of these eggs. These studies showed the majority of patients didn't come back to use their eggs, although this was a smaller, maybe a couple of years that they looked at in these studies, where we've looked over, the last 8 years in our data. Patients that are returning for egg thaw cycles, if you remember when we looked at the demographics of patients having their eggs frozen, mostly between 35 and 37, you can see where that shift is in the graph of patients that are having their eggs thawed. So the shift is that over 40 is when they're mostly returning to use their eggs in egg thaw cycles. One thing I thought would be useful to look at, and I mentioned at the beginning how excited we were in laboratories to have this new technology of vitrification, was to look at the survival rates. Now, it's quite a crude way of looking at it. What I've done for the survival rates is looked at the number of eggs used for mixing, for IVF, well, for ICSI, over the number of eggs thawed. And you can see from 2010, there has been a general trend of increasing survival rates, which I think has showed big improvements in technology, which is very encouraging. The fertilization rate, so that's the number of embryos created over the number of eggs mixed. It's not quite a pretty picture of the survival rates. It does dip up and down a bit, but again, there is a general trend of improvements up to 2018, which again is encouraging. Success rates, looking at our data that we've got, this looks at data between 2016 and 2018. What we're looking at is a survival rate, a success rate of around 15%, which obviously compared to fresh IVF is significantly lower. But what we have to remember with the data from the HFEA, these can be eggs that were frozen quite a long time ago using slow freezing methods, and don't reflect probably the quality of the eggs that we've got in storage now. So it will be interesting going forward to look at the survival rates with the new technology and how eggs are frozen now and used, because we do know in the literature that with using donor eggs that are frozen, we can get comparable success rates. So from a HFEA point of view, where are issues of concern? I'm sure these will be picked up later by the speakers. I think our main concern is obviously information provision that patients are getting the egg freezing. And I know Zeynep's going to cover this in detail from the study that she's undertaken. Patients do use websites as their source of information. So it's really important that they get honest and accurate information regarding the success rates, because patients don't need to be led into a false sense of security thinking that they've got 10 eggs in the freezer and that's going to give them a baby in 10 years' time. So a HFEA message would be that websites really do need to provide information that is clear, accurate, comprehensive, and as evidence-based as possible. People that listen to and join into the PET conference will be well aware that the CMA approached the HFEA over a year ago now because they were concerned about consumer law in provision of fertility treatments, and whether, regardless of whether that's IVF or egg freezing, that guidance will stand and that consumer law will stand. So that hopefully will help protect patients. It will help a better degree of price transparency. It will help mis-selling of treatments. It will make sure that clinics present accurate and honest success rates about different treatments, and also it will help patients have a better contract with when they're paying for their private treatment, which is obviously where elective egg freezing would fall. So just to finish up with, it would be our expectations of clinics if they're providing egg freezing. So as I've said, and I really can't highlight this enough, that clinics must make sure they provide clear information about treatment and costs. The patients should be well informed, be offered counselling. It is about reproductive choice. It is about preserving fertility, but it needs to be sure that that's not a guarantee. And we are seeing patients freeze those eggs, as I saw in that earlier graph, of over 40, and they really do need to have clear expectations. And as Sarah mentioned, at the moment, we do have the 10-year storage limit. And when you're counselling patients and you're consenting patients for egg freezing, this really does need to be kept in mind at the moment. We know that there's the consultation at the moment. We've had We know the department have had many responses which they're currently going through, but as it stands at the moment, there is obviously a limitation in the length that the eggs can be frozen. Thank you.
Our next speaker now is Dr. Zeynep Gurtin. Zeynep is a lecturer in women's health at University College London's EGA Institute for Women's Health, and she's a research associate at the University of Cambridge's Reproductive Sociology Research Group. And we'll be hearing about the research that she's recently published, I'm sure.
That was great to have the context from Rachel to go on and to kind of bring in a little bit more of the social reaction to egg freezing. I think we know that egg freezing is taking place in a context of lowest ever birth rates, childlessness being on the rise, mothers in England and Wales becoming older than they've ever been before, conception rates rising for the over 40s, and increasing numbers of women choosing to go for solo motherhood. So egg freezing as a technology enters our social consciousness within this broad context. And really in the media, the way egg freezing is talked about has been prolific and mixed. So articles have talked about the huge increase over recent years about the numbers of women freezing their eggs, reasons for why women freeze their eggs, including, most importantly, because they're not in the right relationship. The age ranges and why women in their 40s are still freezing their eggs, whether women are being given false hope, whether this is empowering technology or whether it's, perhaps not quite as good as it might seem, the 10-year storage limits. And most recently, there have been articles discussing how the recent lockdown is pushing up an even greater surge in egg freezing as single women lose the chance to meet potential partners. But it's very rare that we encounter a discussion of the business of egg freezing, which is why it's such a privilege and a pleasure to take part in this seminar this evening, because that's a really, really important aspect of this technology. So how do women find out about egg freezing, elective egg freezing? If a woman is considering doing this, well, I think the first thing she does is go onto Google. And I did this yesterday. And when you go onto Google, in London, these are the first hits that come up. And I think this is a fairly similar scenario for most places in the world. When you Google egg freezing, the places that tend to come up are the private clinics which are offering this technology. So my colleague Emily Tierman and I felt it was important to do an analysis of how fertility clinics market egg freezing on their websites and what do they talk about, what do they present on these forums, which are these very important places for women to receive their information. We analysed the top 15 UK clinic websites, which between them conducted almost 90% of all egg freezing cycles in the UK between 2008 and 2018. And we did a three-phase analysis, a content analysis of the way egg freezing was discussed and the images provided, an analysis of the costs, and a quality analysis regarding the kinds of available information. And not to completely give away the punchline right now, but our results showed that there was a biased framing of elective egg freezing, overall an inaccurate representation of costs, and poor quality of information on these websites. So I just want to go into this information in a little bit more detail for you now in terms of what we discovered. So as Rachel mentioned, egg freezing cycles have been on the rise, and this is figures from the HFEA. And although HFEA haven't published the sort of differences between how many have been medical and how many have been private cycles, we can look at the difference between NHS and private cycles. And as you can see, most of that increase over the past 10 years has taken place within the private sector. Now, we conducted a Freedom of Information request to the HFEA asking for the numbers of cycles of egg freezing undertaken by each clinic in the UK. And interestingly, what we discovered was, even though there are now very many clinics offering egg freezing, the very large percentage of cycles is conducted by a very small handful of clinics or clinic groups. So sort of 6 main clinics undertake a very large percentage of egg freezing cycles. So it's very important for us to know how their websites discuss this technology. So as I said, our first phase of analysis was a content analysis. And there we found 4 dominant themes in how egg freezing was discussed in clinic websites. Firstly, egg freezing was discussed as a new and exciting technology with a lot of discussion around, vitrification and the increased possibilities that came with vitrification. Secondly, egg freezing was discussed as a solution to a modern woman's life circumstances. So phrases such as, you may not have met the right partner yet, you might be very busy at work, you may not feel now is the right time to have a child, etc. It was also discussed as a main means to gain control, freedom, and more reproductive choices. And the fourth theme was that it was a means to avoid the reproductive risks of aging. So in many of these websites, there was a discussion around how, as women become older, risks of miscarriage increase, risks of infertility increase. But interestingly, there was very little or no discussion of any potential risks associated with the elective egg freezing process, and little explicit discussion of things like success rates. So we felt these presentations led to a biased view of egg freezing, in which there was sort of unrealistic anxieties about not freezing your eggs and unrealistic expectations being set up about the process and the potential success rates. So some of the sort of very common types of phrases that we saw were, start a family later without worrying about your biological clock. Egg freezing offers women the choice of when to become a mother and provides more flexibility around fertility decisions. This empowering process gives you a choice to make a decision to start a family when the time is right for you. The development of egg vitrification is a groundbreaking development in its ability to empower women and provide them with the freedom to choose when they have their children. And as you can see, these kinds of statements in some give the impression that perhaps the technology is more certain or more of a guarantee than it really is, if we think about some of the statistics that Rachel just presented to us. In terms of the cost analysis, when we looked at the advertised costs for a cycle of elective egg freezing, what we found for these top 15 clinics was that prices ranged between £2,800 to £3,895 at the time we took our snapshot. So this was almost 2 years ago now, so these prices may have changed. Everything is, indexed to when we took our website snapshots, of course. However, the elements that were included in this advertised price of a single cycle really varied between different clinics. So some included blood tests, scans, sedation, and others charged that additional on top of the advertised price. None of the advertised prices included fertility testing, including a scan to determine antral follicle count, an anti-Müllerian hormone test, compulsory screening for HIV and hepatitis, or the initial doctor consultation, all of which are necessary elements to undertake an egg freezing cycle, and the cost for those ranged between £330 to £1,345. So on average, the true cost of a cycle of egg freezing ranged actually between, almost £4,000 to £5,000, on average about a third higher than the advertised cost. So as you can see, the costs that were advertised were around £3,000 to £4,000, but when the additional elements were added, we quickly came up to a figure that was on average a third higher, which is a significant consideration for women who are budgeting for this technology. And finally, for the quality assessment, we took the guidelines on the HFEA website, which are in line with the Advertising and Standard Authorities Code, about what clinic websites in general should look like. And we transformed that into some points that are specific for egg freezing. So we created a 10-point list of what we felt a good quality information provision on egg freezing would look like. So data from the last 3 years, live birth rates, raw numbers, HFEA being referred to as a source of data, etc. So this was a 10-point scale. 9 to 10 points would be considered excellent, 0, 1, 2 points would be considered poor. And in fact, when we looked through all the websites, 12 out of the 15 rated as poor, with 3 scoring 0, so not fulfilling any of those criteria, 7 scoring only 1, and 2 scoring 2. So there were 2 clinics that rated as good, and 2 clinics that rated as fair, and 1 that was rated as good. So just to give you a sense, obviously we had the figures from Rachel, but this one clinic, this is a direct quote from a clinic, had what they called objective statistics and expectations. And if you look at the bottom two lines, they say if you collect 10 eggs and 10 eggs are frozen, the original group of 10 eggs should lead to a 60 to 80% chance of a cumulative live birth. Now that is a really misleading statement. I have no idea how they've arrived at that, because obviously it diverges quite significantly from any research published on live birth rates from egg freezing, but it also doesn't seem to make sense in terms of how to calculate success rates or potentials. So there are a range of problems with our findings regarding whether women are receiving honest, accurate and transparent information, whether they're being exploited and provided with false hope, whether they're able to see accurate costs, whether they might be paying over the odds, and most importantly, whether they have a clear understanding of all that's involved. And the most important aspects of that is, of course, they need to be able to do all of these things in order to make fully informed decisions. And this is important both for reasons of medical ethics and for consumer rights. So I know that some clinics have already contacted us to tell us that they've altered their websites since our paper has been published. And we do believe that that's a very efficient and quick way for clinics to respond to findings like this. So in our conclusions, egg freezing is unlikely to ever be funded or covered in national health services and will therefore continue to grow as a singularly commercial aspect of the ART industry. Fertility clinic websites in the UK, taken in general, at the moment provide a poor standard of information, and we would argue need to be urgently improved for reasons of both medical ethics and consumer rights. Our 10-point criteria, which we published in the paper, provides a very useful framework to judge the marketing of egg freezing by clinic websites and can easily be used by clinics to make simple, effective, concrete, and actually very cheap improvements that are patient-centered and patient-focused. And we believe that regulators and professional bodies have a responsibility to encourage or perhaps even enforce ethical practice from clinics in order to protect patients' rights. Thank you very much.
Next this evening, we have Dr. Lucy van der Wiel, and Lucy is a research associate at the University of Cambridge's Reproductive Sociology Research Group, and she's author of the book, which was published just at the end of last year, Freezing Fertility, Oocyte Cryopreservation and the Gender Politics of Aging.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Sarah, and it's an absolute honour and joy to join this event. I always love the events put on by PET, so it's great to be a part of it this time. So today I'd like to talk about fertility, finance and egg freezing. I think if we think about egg freezing, it's really important to keep in mind what are the clinical and commercial infrastructures that are underlying the emergence of this possibility, the way in which we can access it in the first place. So let's have a look. I would like to look specifically at what I call the financialization of fertility, which means that fertility becomes a frontier for financial investment, that there are new financial products such as fertility loans and fertility insurance that play a key role in egg freezing, and that there's also a conceptual shift in understanding what fertility is, a move away from using IVF if you find that you cannot conceive, but rather moving towards an idea of investing in your future fertility by using egg freezing as a proactive fertility management technology. Now, to understand this, we can go all the way back to the beginning of IVF, and we can see that the relation to capital accumulation has been part of the sector from its very inception. Here we see the first IVF baby with Bob Edwards, who later, they both grew older, and here she is 40 years old a couple of years ago. And Bob Edwards and Patrick Steptoe started the first IVF clinic, and was quickly followed by new IVF clinics at the time in the 80s when Margaret Thatcher was in power. And Marilyn Strathern and Sarah Franklin have both talked about how the development of IVF as a sector has been part of an enterprise culture that's characterized by Thatcherism. Since then, in the 21st century, IVF has changed dramatically since those early years. So, of course, egg freezing has changed, has an important new technology that has been introduced, has become more popular since about a decade ago when the experimental label was taken away by the ASRM. but also new technologies that have been introduced that expand the IVF cycle alongside egg freezing, so-called add-on technologies, for example, for embryo selection or introducing artificial intelligence in the IVF cycle. And we see that industry partners in the pharmaceutical, biotechnological, and genetic industries are all introducing new technologies and diversifying their portfolios with these new technologies. Now, a third development is that there's more private equity investment. So financial investors are becoming more interested in the fertility sector in the last decade. That clinic that Bob Edwards started, for example, Bourne Hall, just 2 months ago in January, was bought up by two Canadian investors. And we see this as quite common in the fertility sector more broadly, that investors buy clinics and then seek to grow their value and then sell them a couple of years later as a way of making money. And this is widespread in the UK. Here are just some examples of investors buying clinics and selling them. And oftentimes the money that is generated by private equity for clinics is used to acquire more clinics so that you get larger fertility groups. So instead of many small clinics, you increasingly have larger groups that buy up the smaller clinics to become larger entities. And that's happening across the world and also in the UK. Now, this is part of a broader financialization of health, it's called. So when we see the introduction of more financial investments, there tends to be a move towards the fertility sector in which the markets expand, in which there's more debt that goes to patients, in which there are more private insurance arrangements alongside public programs, more mergers and acquisitions, so getting those larger groups, and also a managerial focus on shareholder value, because the shareholders become an important part in the running of clinics, for example. In Australia, Wendy Lipworth has interviewed people about this development, and she has found that people running IVF clinics suddenly had to keep shareholders, investors, or bankers' interests in mind in running their clinic, which created a new dynamic for them. Private equity is often presented as a good thing because it allows us to introduce new technologies in a faster way. But there's also some concerns about whether that speed is a good thing if the evidence base isn't clear yet. There's also a focus on possibly private equity creating more affordable treatments through economies of scale, but there's also concerns about potential monopolies being created by these large groups. And there is a sense that private equity will create more growth and more availability of treatment, but there's also some concerns about there possibly being some incentives for people to, for example, have more cycles per year. We see this with one large group, for example, describes their share incentive scheme, saying that fertility specialists who consistently deliver more than 300 cycles per year get paid extra. So these are some of the potential conflicts of interest that arise. Now, specifically in relation to egg freezing, we see there have been a lot of capital investments in specifically egg freezing startups. For example, these are primarily US startups that focus on the egg freezing process itself, or startups that focus on egg freezing through providing loans or insurance arrangements. This enables the emergence of egg freezing enterprises and materializes the idea that there will be growth of egg freezing in the future, that it will be something that creates return on investment. And in this way, egg freezing and the investments in egg freezing are at the heart of a step change in IVF. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So one thing that happens when there's a lot of investment is that there can become something called consolidation, so that you get from smaller clinics to larger groups. So one example is Prelude, for example, an egg freezing oriented fertility group that got $200 million investment from the equity and bought dozens of clinics. Within 1 year, they were the second largest IVF group in the US. And then a couple of years later, we see here the cycles. And a couple of years later, they became the largest fertility service, at least according to this news outlet. And it shows how these investments can make new groups quite influential and big very quickly. The investors of this new fertility group said, we were really surprised how low the awareness is of fertility services such as egg freezing, and they are trying to reach younger patients through, for example, digital media. And that will give them a sizable upside in years to come, is the expectation. So they have, for example, Dr. Oz on their board, and they create beautiful platforms to access new patients and access a new patient group that becomes available through egg freezing. They really promote younger egg freezing. So the president, for example, says we're looking at targeting women in their 20s and early 30s, really trying to reach the younger crowd. We see marketing campaigns that say slogans like, you'll never be more fertile than you are today. And if you want to go even earlier, there's also fertility insurance for your children, so you can insure them for their future potential infertility. Earlier freezing comes with its own financial consequences. So we see here the costs per year of freezing those eggs, and those build up more if you freeze earlier. Now, this is linked to fertility financing. So the provision of loans, which is prevalent in egg freezing, we see that for the younger people under 34, over half has more than $10,000 in debt in the US when they do IVF. But also in the UK, we have now more fertility lenders. And when you combine the idea of proactive freezing with the idea that you can do that when you don't have much money when you're younger by paying later, there's another avenue of generating revenue and value with egg freezing by moving the money around. So moving the risk from the patient to the clinic through egg freezing, and then the clinic to the lender by providing loans so that people can get treated earlier and generate more income through the interest payments and the fees that come with loans. Now, a third financial product is fertility insurance, which also plays a key role in egg freezing. We've seen a lot of discussions around Apple and Facebook offering coverage for egg freezing, and that has since expanded dramatically. And the discussion is often about, is this good for access, or is it a form of coercion? And when we look at the market leader, for example, Progeny, who offers a lot of fertility insurance in the US and more broadly, it's not so much about that dynamic, but more about what the return on investment is for employers to offer fertility insurance. So, for example, reinforcing company values as being diverse and inclusive for female employees, or avoiding the indirect costs that come with people getting twins because they implant several embryos instead of following the Progeny plan that looks for single embryo transfer. We see that these new fertility insurance arrangements are very influential. For example, Progeny has matched with Mercer, the largest HR company in the world, and now cover over 2 million people, 2 million employees who get fertility insurance through them. This fertility insurance streamlines egg freezing with other technologies, and that's where we get back to the add-on technologies. So, for example, egg freezing insurance may be linked to insurance that also offers genetic testing or assisted hatching for embryos, and offers a full patient experience. So it's not just covering the money, but also really framing that experience with particular websites, with online concierge services and online information about how to interpret your cycle. And this also is linked, for example, with apps that help with the emotional roller coaster of the treatment itself. And so therefore we can look at fertility insurance as not so much a discouragement of reproduction altogether, but a way in which the idea of a proactive, intensified and streamlined approach to fertility management is institutionalized through the employer. And this seeks to maximize both reproductive and financial return on investment for the patient and for the employer and for the clinic and the insurer. So all these different developments together show you a very quick overview of the financialization of fertility that happens in relation to egg freezing. We see new clinical and commercial infrastructures through which egg freezing becomes accessible. We see new underlying treatment rationales for proactive fertility management. And we see that the financial products of loans and insurances play a key role in the stories and the streamlining of egg freezing more broadly.
Eileen is a founding partner at Passion Capital and former chair of Tech Nation.
I am someone who's spent my career in the technology sector and am now a venture capital investor, which is at the very, very low end of that private equity industry, which Lucy was just chatting about. And so my perspectives are really quite varied, I guess I would say. And I'm happy to talk about some of the investment sort of theses that we have, and why, for instance, this has been a focus of our firm at the earliest stages, looking at software technology and how it might help produce or enable better customer outcomes, or give women more choices. We're not so much focused on the big ROI that Lucy was talking about, because we don't have that kind of capital to deploy, but we do believe in the digitalization of services and information and education to help empower patients and people who want to sort of take family planning a little bit more seriously. In addition, and I guess as a process of doing that, I am a non-executive director on Fertifa. Fertifa is the UK's largest supplier of corporate benefits for reproductive health. And obviously this is for egg freezing, but also for IVF and for family planning, not just for women, but maybe LGBTQ employees and all that. So I will talk about that perspective. But I think the interesting thing is to admit that Sarah admitted the reason that she kindly invited me to join is because, and this is such an embarrassing claim to fame, but I'll take it and use it for today. I was quoted in the Daily Mail, usually not something to be proud of, back in November, because following our investment in Fertifa, my sort of premise was that I believed employers should offer reproductive health benefits as a corporate benefit. And my sort of thinking was that more relevant, more directly relevant, certainly, for employees than, say, pension planning, something that would benefit them, in 10, 20, 30 years' time, whereas I believe fertility benefits are things that are probably much more relatable and more immediately impactful to them. So with that sort of as a sort of a premise, I'm also going to talk a little bit about why I've probably become so interested in this. And I think it's not just from being a woman. You'll hear from my accent, I was born and raised in the United States. I did mention already that I've sort of been born of the technology sector. So I'm not a health sort of expert at all, not a policy expert either. But I have worked for Apple, I've worked for the big technology companies, I've worked for large corporations. I also have the pleasure of sitting on the board of Dixon's Carphone PLC, and I'm also on the board for Monzo Bank, which is not nearly as big, but now touches 5 million customers in the UK. And so from a governance point of view, and with more than 1,500 employees, we think about obviously what those employees' well-being might be defined by. And also just as an individual, my fertility sort of story is one that has made me really mindful about options and choices for women. I, personal choices aside and judgment aside, I've had a sort of what's the best way to put it? Maybe the epitome or the case study of choices where in my 20s in California, I did come to a view that I wasn't ready to become a parent. And so I chose to terminate. I then came to London in 2004, so 17 years ago, started a family quite late, and actually had an accidental pregnancy with someone that I'd only known for 6 months, but decided I was going to go ahead and do that because I was 35 years old. Proceeded to have a family, give birth to 4 children, which I'm really, really, privileged and obviously over the moon to have been able to do. But then now have a partner of the last 5 years who's younger than I am. And so even though I was 42 years old, sort of thinking it would be great actually to have another one. Sorry, I was 42 when I had my last one. And so when I then got together with my current partner, we thought we would like to have another one, but I was well past 45 at that point. And we actually did go through 2 courses of IVF. And having done all the things that I've done, like I said, sort of personal judgments aside, and whether or not I'm a very judicious or careful person, we can park that for a different conversation. I am someone who really, felt privileged to have the choices that I had throughout my life. I know that I've been really fortunate, and I sort of lament the fact that I hadn't considered egg freezing earlier in my life. Who would have thought that I would ever need it or want it or even consider it? Because I did have 4 beautiful children of my own. And who would have thought I would have even had children in the first place, since I moved to London when I was 35 years old and thinking at that point that I wouldn't need to start a family. And so I just sort of come from this point of view that we have no idea what life's going to throw at us. That's what makes life so wonderful, and probably something that the pandemic has helped to sort of crystallize for everybody or magnify over the last year. And if technology has gotten to a place where there's no guarantee, and it's why it's fantastic that all of the first 3 panelists have talked about the sort of risks, the uncertainty, and certainly the need for clarification and great education around what these technologies can provide, it would be, I think, to people's benefit to understand more about it, and certainly to have the option to consider these things for their personal choices. And I do think one route to that, because of the cost, would be through employers who do think about corporate benefits. And so moving on then, I'm not going to read the slides to you because you're very capable of doing that, but these statistics I think are really quite interesting. The first three are actually US data based, so they're not UK statistics, but as has already been acknowledged with some of the other panelists, the US is slightly a more developed market than the UK in terms of uptake, but also just in terms of the conversation and the normalization of fertility and fertility treatments. And you can see here how important it is to the workforce and how many people actually consider, fertility as being not only a big part of their personal lives, but in having an impact in what they think about their employers, where they might work, when they want to work, and whether or not they feel really engaged while they're trying to work, and which obviously translates to a productivity matter for the employers. And then, of course, the last statistic, that 81% of UK millennial workers say that they prefer employers who offer fertility benefits. So then moving on, and I think, the reason why it's been such a pleasure to be on this panel, to listen to the other speakers, and also, looking forward to the Q&A, I think it's important to think about and really helpful to wonder why it hasn't been quite as normalized in the UK. We've obviously seen statistics about how much uptake there's been for IVF as well as egg freezing over recent years, but it's still nothing compared to, even on a proportional level, the US or some of the other markets. And whether or not any of normalizing this conversation might help sort of empower women to think about what they want to be educated on, or to get access to more education, whether or not that actually affects their roles within decision-making, within organizations, within companies that may or may not decide to offer these benefits, and what that reflects in terms of social trends and what maybe they're seeing in their peer group. And then I think the final point is the point that I had made, probably not so eloquently, but to the Daily Mail, about how I do think corporates in the UK do offer a great set of benefits for their employees, but they should consider offering fertility benefits as a, as just one of the really obvious choices, like they do for pension contribution, for example. And so I know a lot of debate is often brought up around whether or not, corporates or employers supporting fertility benefits can be taken as a really negative signal, or very discouraging about, parking family choices or family options, and whether it's putting too much focus, therefore, on work productivity, while, other women might be thinking about other things. And for me, I really don't think it's mutually exclusive. I don't think it actually should be seen as a negative, or something that's actually driving or saying to women that they should focus on work and therefore think about fertility later. I actually think it's quite the opposite. It says think about what you need in order to have, the resources and the sort of circumstances for you to do family planning, to start thinking about your family, whether that's now or whether you might want to later. It's also an opportunity, I think, to think about whether or not you have the sort of information that you want. And if you've got information coming from your employer, for example, about high blood pressure and how important it is to set up your desk in an ergonomic fashion so that you don't end up with back problems or other kinds of health issues that would drive you to see physios, for example, you should also think about reproductive health and how you can do your best to maintain that. And so for me, it's really about complementing what really helps employee well-being. And on that point, in terms of why I think it's really important for employers, we know and we see that for companies, it does drive greater authenticity. It does reflect what we've seen that employees care about, whether they feel like they're able or safe to talk about that in the workplace or not. It does actually help promote this feeling that women can be part of the conversation, leadership conversations, and determinations about what benefits should be. It's also, as we saw in the statistics that I showed in the second slide, critical for attracting talent and retaining talent, because we see that people will make their choices and their decisions about where to work. If they're going to be working in financial services, whether they work for one bank or another, they might be looking at whether or not the benefits are attractive to them, or if they feel they're sufficient. And finally, we talked a little bit about engagement already. I don't know how much conversation that, this group has had before, but certainly there are a fair number of statistics about how distracting, how stressful, and how preoccupying it is for people when they do have fertility challenges. And if they are trying to start a family, for example, and whether or not that does really affect their productivity at work. And this is the case, obviously, when they're talking and planning families, as well as if they're going through an IVF process or a cycle, or even doing egg freezing. So again, none of this is mutually exclusive. I feel it's part of the same conversation and part of informing a set of choices. And of course, there is the absenteeism of going through these kinds of decisions and these life processes that, again, if employers and corporates were to be supportive, really does help how people are feeling about what they're going through and normalizing it, as well as sort of advocating real, positive awareness and education. And so finally, just to clarify, we're not just talking about, egg freezing cycles in terms of what we support at Fertifa, which is one of the companies, like I mentioned, that Passion Capital invested in and why I'm able to be on that board. It's actually about talking about policies that actually benefit employees and workers when they're in their workplace. I mentioned for me at the outset, it's about improving customer outcomes, and patient experiences, or simply women's experiences, or people that are going through fertility, questions and discussions and decisions. It's about offering financial support to a certain extent, as Lucy was just talking about. We haven't invested in any insurance or financing schemes. There are lots of those that do exist today. I wouldn't be the first to defend any of them. Some are better than the others, and they are certainly trying to get return on their investment. But it does actually offer a tool for people if it's something. And again, that's something where a workplace can actually help to qualify, maybe help compare what are better plans than others, and maybe do some kind of subsidization from the workplace in order to minimize the amount of debt or financing that somebody would have to go through. And of course, assessments, when you're doing any other kind of health assessments, I use that example of your ergonomic workspace. There should be other, areas of health that your employer is also worried about, because it does affect your productivity and your longer term contributions to the business. And then most importantly, it is about education. Hopefully you've heard that I've mentioned that on every slide that I've talked about. For me, it's really important that we normalize the conversation, that we make sure that workplaces become safe spaces for people to talk about fertility benefits, fertility cycles, egg freezing, IVF, reproductive health, and healthcare more broadly, because that really does impact mental health and well-being.
And we have Marcia Inhorn, and Marcia is Professor of Anthropology and International Affairs at Yale University.
I'm really going to emphasize that this is what women told me that they wanted for what I would call patient-centered egg freezing care. And just to reiterate, many things have already been said, but to reiterate the sort of demographics of who's trying elective egg freezing today, really all the studies show that it's highly educated women. They are hetero for the most part, and they are unpartnered. More than 80% of women coming for egg freezing are without a partner, although most would like a partner. They are 30-something women. The average age, as we've seen, is actually mid to late 30s. And they tend to be successful professionals who do have resources to consider this technology. And they're trying to be proactive. They want to retain their fertility. And I say that these are women who are hopeful for what I'm calling the 3 Ps: partnership, pregnancy, and parenting. But I want to reiterate, as Zeynep shown us, most egg freezing is practiced in IVF clinics, not specialty clinics, IVF clinics. And IVF is a technology that was developed really for couples, for partnered people. Therefore, IVF clinics are what we might call very married spaces. You've got husbands and partners, male partners coming in. And for single women coming for egg freezing, they feel lonely, abandoned, often stigmatized, sometimes misrecognized, assumed to be married with a partner, and it ends up leading to mistreatment. Women say, it really adds insult to injury to be a woman going into these spaces where almost everybody's got a partner. And so women started talking to me about the need for what we might call patient-centered care and the need for patient-centered safe spaces within IVF clinics or in specialty egg freezing clinics, which we'll talk about. So patient-centered care has been very well developed. There's a rich literature on it, including for IVF and infertility care. Patient-centered care is respectful of and responsive to individual patient preferences, needs, and values, thus ensuring that patient values guide all clinical decisions. And so we did a big study of 150 women, mostly in the US. My colleague Daphne Birnbaum Carmeli did some in Israel. But American women in particular, much more than the Israeli women, had a lot to say about what they thought should be improved to have sort of best practices in egg freezing. And that is what I would like to focus on. In patient-centered care, we talk about system factors and human factors. And so I'm going to go through the 7 system factors briefly, and then the human factors. And many we've already touched on in this panel, but I'm going to go through these: information, competence, coordination, accessibility, comfort, continuity, and a big one that's usually not emphasized is cost, but it's huge, as we've seen already. So information, Rachel talked about the HFEA data. We don't really have access to that good kind of data in the US, and women really wanted it. They said, we really want to see how many cycles have been done. What does the data show? The need, per Zeynep's presentation, for informative and accurate, not only websites, but the advertising going out to women. And then once women decide that they're going to try to do this, they want egg freezing specific information, informational sessions, instructional media that is separate from what other women going through IVF might be exposed to. And clinicians themselves, they want to have clinicians talk to them about the procedures, the risks, the numbers of eggs that should be collected and the cycles that should be done, and the expected outcomes, things that have already been emphasized very much today. So it needs competence in the clinic. And women said, it's not only the physicians that we want to have as competent people, it's everybody, the nurses, the counselors, the administrators, that they need to know that we're not here for IVF, that we're here for egg freezing, and they know about egg freezing and can talk to us about it. And women in America really said it would be nice to have a diverse clinical staff with expertise on egg freezing, because women are coming in single. There may be gay women coming for egg freezing, ethnic and racial and religious minorities with their own particular issues and circumstances. Coordination and integration. A huge issue for women was that their community physicians, their GPs and gynecologists, were not giving them enough information on fertility decline or about egg freezing. And if you were considering it, where should you go? So the need to have those initial conversations with your own doctor, and then easy referral and easy appointment making in a clinic that offers egg freezing. Also, community pharmacies that provide the medications, there needs to be good coordination with pharmacists as well. Accessibility, we've talked a bit about, it's huge. You know, women who are single professional women are working very dynamic and busy jobs. They wanted hours in the morning and in the evening before and after work, with reasonable wait times and wait lines to get an appointment at a clinic. And then when they get there, they want egg freezing only services, women only egg freezing injection classes. I'm going to say more about that. And private areas within IVF clinics that are really devoted to egg freezing patients, not IVF couples, a sort of separation of egg freezing from IVF. And this is really where the sort of desire, if you will, for these standalone specialty egg freezing clinics that Lucy has talked about. I mean, they're emerging in the US partly for profit, but women too said, you know, I prefer to go to an egg freezing only place where they're only going to be working with women like me. So that's something to think about. Physical comfort. There are a lot of hormonal injections that women take before IVF and before egg freezing. And if you're doing IVF, there's an assumption that the partner is going to help with the injections, whereas single women going for egg freezing are usually by themselves and have to self-inject on their own. They want instruction, support, and assistance. And then reasonable expectations about what it's going to be like going through a cycle, what are the potential side effects that could happen, and days lost from work. Many women said, you know, I was never really informed that I might want to take a couple days off from work, and I didn't feel well on the day after retrieval, and it was a real problem for my work. So timely management of women's time and timely management for women who do have complications. I mean, women can have problems after egg retrieval and egg freezing, for example, ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which is not insignificant, and they wanted to be informed about what to expect in terms of their physical comfort. Continuity and transition. Okay, on the day of egg retrieval and egg freezing in the US, it's a requirement that you have somebody who's going to be there with you to take you home on that day. You have to have transportation. You've gone through a procedure with anesthesia, and it's not safe to drive home by yourself. Single women may not have anybody who can help them, no family around, no friends who can take a day off of work. And so they want clinics to help them with reliable transportation services and home healthcare options for that day of retrieval. Then information on next steps, based on what happens. Did you get 3 eggs in a cycle or did you get 20 eggs? Women want someone to talk to them about what they should do next. Should they schedule another cycle? Should they stop there? What should they expect? So clear information and guidelines, including on egg disposition and storage limits, which we've talked about in the UK. There's that 10-year limit on freezing eggs. We don't have a national guideline in the US, and many countries don't. So women want to know, like, how long should I store them? And if I don't keep them, they want clear consent forms on the disposition of those eggs. Can they give them to their sisters? Can they give them to friends? Should they give them to research, or should they be disposed? They need help in decision making. Now, the cost in patient-centered care articles, they don't usually talk about cost as a system dimension, but it's huge. It was a huge issue for women, and we've heard why. It's expensive to go through egg freezing in the UK. In the US, and I'm going to do this in US dollars, an average cycle is somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 US dollars. And there were women who repeated cycles and spent up to $50,000, even $100,000 when all was said and done on egg freezing. And so it's very expensive. And so some clinics are figuring out how to do packages so that there are discounts built in if a woman needs to repeat and undertake multiple cycles. We've heard about financing. Women want financing options. They want payment plans, so that they can do it over a monthly payment plan rather than in one lump sum chunk. They would like clinics to accept credit cards easily. And if a cycle is canceled for whatever reason, they would like to get refunds because the cancel didn't go forward. Insurance, which Eileen has just talked about incredibly well, women who are paying for this out of their own pockets often said, I wish my employer covered egg freezing. My employer provides fertility benefits for IVF for married women. They felt discriminated against as single women who were not getting their egg freezing covered. And what many women just said, I wish I worked for Google. I wished I worked for Facebook. It's expensive to pay for this on your own. And there was a feeling that it's discriminatory against single women who are trying to be proactive and planful, but just couldn't find a partner and would like to freeze their eggs with help from somebody, okay? And so then annual storage fees, it bothered women that maybe the fees start out one year at $500, but the next year the bill is for $750, and then $1,000, and then $1,200. They would like to see stability. Hugely, there was real concern among women about other women who didn't make as much money, who were maybe lower or middle income women, including their sisters, their friends, who would never have access to egg freezing because it's too expensive. And they wanted clinics to think about this price consciousness and income-based discounts for women who didn't make a lot of money. And then briefly, the human factors: attitude and relationship with staff, communication, patient involvement and privacy, and emotional support. Relationships with staff. Some clinics in America, and I think, you've spoken about this, Zeynep, there are a lot of different clinics, many in America, and some are huge with many, physicians, many nurses, many staff members, and women felt that it was an assembly line. They were being bounced from one person to another. They would like to develop one-on-one relationships with single providers who take them through the entire egg freezing process, a nurse, a clinician who they can count on. And they said, we're alone. We're trying to absorb all the information by ourselves. We're trying to navigate this on our own. They would like some extra clinical support because they're not there with a partner. Communication is crucial. They wanted adequate pre-egg freezing screening and counseling, someone talking to them, a counselor, a social worker. Going through it, women talked about appropriate bedside manner. And I can tell you, some clinicians do not have that. They say outrageous things to women, making them feel very bad. And they were very concerned about how post-retrieval information was conveyed, especially women who do get bad news, that they didn't get very many eggs out of the cycle, and they want appropriate delivery of that information compassionately. And then just realistic expectations about, the potential outcomes. If you've got 3 eggs stored versus 15 eggs stored, what does that mean when you go back potentially to use them? What are your actual chances of getting a child out of those frozen eggs? Patient involvement and privacy, again, I must reiterate, this is mostly a population feeling very sad that they never found a partner. And there's so much that could be said about that. I mean, really, I've written a lot about that. What's happened that so many successful, highly educated women are ending up in their 30s without the partner that they'd always wanted. So there needs to be sensitivity to that, including in the materials that women receive and sign off on in IVF clinics. They want egg freezing specific consent forms that don't require the consent from the partner, okay? And then finally, emotional support. This is where I end. Women feel that there need to be psychologists and social workers in clinics who focus on them as egg freezing women, not IVF patients, but as women doing egg freezing and their specific issues and needs. They would like to see egg freezing support groups in clinics, especially in large clinics that are able to do this. And a huge issue that we haven't talked about, I have a new article that's just appeared on this, but the fact that more than a third of women who are single are coming for egg freezing after a huge relationship trauma, divorces, breakups, broken engagements, partnership breakups after many years together, and they are feeling traumatized. They never expected this to happen, and they're feeling bad. They've just broken up, and they want some understanding for that, that this is what's happened to them. And I will say the one little bit of bright news in the US is that egg freezing settlements are now increasingly being seen in divorce cases. Okay, women are getting, settlements from their partners in divorce. And so just to acknowledge that women going through egg freezing who are in clinics alone feel this potential loneliness. They often feel very empowered for having done this, and there's a lot of positive to be said. But being a single woman in an IVF married space can make you feel lonely, and we need to acknowledge that. And so we really need to be talking to clinics about provision of maximal support for women going through egg freezing.
Is there a concern that extending the time limit will encourage women to freeze their eggs earlier and therefore take on unnecessary risks? And that's from an anonymous attendee. So Rachel, do you want to go with that one first? Are there any risks in freezing them younger? Are they unnecessary, or are the risks unnecessary?
Well, of course, there's always going to be risks around IVF. It's a surgical procedure, and what's important is the information the person considering having their eggs frozen is given. And it is obviously a discussion that's between their doctor and themselves to weigh up those risks and the benefits. And of course, it depends on the age of the patient and their plans for their life and where they are at the moment. So I would say for younger patients, counselling is important, and also really understanding the risks. And the success rates, because we know that success rates, up to the age of 35 are a good prognosis. So maybe, that's built into that conversation, that there isn't such a dramatic rush for when you are younger.
And Zeynep, I know you've got some views on this issue, that's why I thought I'd go to you second.
I mean, I think the 10-year storage limit has obviously caused a lot of heartache for some women in the UK who've kind of come up towards the end of that limit and have not yet been ready to use their eggs, or feel that, what Emily Jackson calls that limit has provided this non-biological clock. So I'm supportive of the campaigns to extend that 10-year limit, but I think that really needs to be accompanied by better oversight of the industry, because I think the last thing we want is huge numbers of younger women feeling unnecessarily anxious about their declining fertility and undertaking a medical procedure that's not necessarily advertised clearly or with full transparency. And as we already know that, you know, with the current average ages of egg freezing being sort of mid to late 30s, that a great majority of those women do go on to conceive naturally outside of clinics. And of course, that rate would be much, much higher if we were talking about women freezing eggs at a younger age. So it is a case of more women having to undergo a needless procedure. And I think perhaps one of the biggest risks of doing egg freezing is a false sense of security in the potential of those eggs to turn into actual babies. So yeah, I think there are other measures that are really important to put in place before that happens.
I suppose, I don't know whether Eileen wants to come in on this, but I suppose one context I hadn't thought about it for women who perhaps choose to freeze their eggs because they've, you know, not met Mr. Right, or perhaps they're doing it, or, you know, perhaps if we succeed in extending the 10-year limit and women do start to freeze them younger, that it will perhaps give them that option if they end up having more than one relationship to have children with a different partner, hang on, I'm overselling it myself now, would have the opportunity to perhaps access IVF using those frozen eggs and try for that. So Eileen, I didn't know if you wanted to come in there.
I mean, I think, like I have the most convoluted personal story, so I doubt that it's a common use case, but I am here to sort of say, you know, that is something, you know, that one wouldn't expect. And that is certainly why I personally had wished that I had been better informed when I was younger. I had another story, another friend just tell me earlier in the week, very, very sadly, that they've just found out that their 15-year-old daughter, unfortunately, her ovaries haven't been developing. And so she's just been told that she would be unlikely to ever have her own children or use her own eggs. She's starting on estrogen treatment so that her uterus will start to develop in case that she can, you know, take from an egg donor and so on and so forth. But the first thing that the family considered naturally was whether or not her mom, which is my friend, would be able to maybe donate her eggs for her daughter to use. And unfortunately, it's a bit late for that in this case. So that's another use case. And I think that, you know, I couldn't agree more about how there needs to be much more transparency and accountability about the information that's shared. I come from technology, so I'm a hugely analytical person and love eating up my stats, even though I acknowledge, sorry, to somebody who asked the question that I misread one of my stats on my slide, sorry. But I love the numbers, and I do think people need to know what these stats are and what the data is telling us. Having said that, it's not mutually exclusive to the fact that I actually think we should also increase access to these opportunities and these options and what they might be able to hold for people.
Lucy or Marcia, do you want to come in on this, or shall we move on to the next question? No, they're happy for me to move on. So the next question, I'm going to start with Rachel again, because this one's been directed to her from, I apologise if I mispronounce your name, Anya Scavin. And she said, what is the legality possibility of a woman who's frozen her eggs for social reasons? If she decides not to use them, can she donate them to recipients or to research?
Yes, of course, there is that opportunity, obviously through informed consent, and donating to research, you would do that via the HFEA consent form. Of course, it does have to be within that 10-year storage limit. So unfortunately, you can't get to the end of the 10 years and at the moment then decide to donate to research or through donation. Donation is a little bit more complex because you have to go through the screening procedures to donate those eggs, but of course it is a possibility, yes.
Great, thanks for clarifying on that. Now, next up, we have a question for Lucy from Rachel Bowlby. And Rachel wants to know, do any clinics offer deals whereby you donate some eggs and you store the rest for yourself, a sort of freeze and share scheme? Or, you know, pay nothing, but they don't pay you either for the eggs that the recipient uses. Not that we can, before I have Rachel shouting at me, not that we pay people for donating eggs in the UK, they're given compensation of up to £750. So I'll make that quite clear right from the get-go. So Lucy.
Yes, I just want to come in quickly to the previous question, because I think Rachel mentioned something important. If anybody is considering freezing their eggs, it is good to consider also whether you would like to be able to donate those eggs later on to someone else. Because if you do, it's a good thing to discuss that with the person who is helping you, with the clinician, so that you know that you may need to do some extra tests to make sure that you can donate them later on, if that's something you're interested in. As for Rachel's question, yes, that exists. For example, at the London Women's Clinic, it's called Freeze and Share, and they have programs. But I feel silly answering that when Zeynep Gurtin is on the panel, who's actually researched what's also called egg sharing. And so she's published about that, and she's interviewed several women about their experiences with that. So I would like to give Zeynep the floor to answer that question, because she knows a lot more about it than I do.
Go ahead, Zeynep.
Yes, there are clinics which do offer programs where women can freeze some eggs and donate some of those eggs to somebody else. So like the traditional egg sharing scheme where women going through IVF would donate some eggs in exchange for IVF, but they would be donating those eggs in exchange for being able to store their eggs for a particular period of time. It's not that common in the UK, but there are clinics that do offer it.
Marcia, do we know, does this happen in the US, that women have these sorts of schemes available, open to them there?
I have never heard of it. In fact, Zeynep and I recently had a discussion about that. I've not heard of it, but maybe it is beginning to happen in some of these private equity kinds of standalone clinics. I mean, Lucy, maybe
Yeah.
but nobody in my study was doing that. But they were very concerned about donating, having designated recipients of their eggs. If they didn't use their eggs, they wanted their sister or a friend to have access. Although a lot of women said, I'm 37, 38, I don't think my eggs are exactly the kinds of eggs that other people would want, but there were discussions about what to do with those eggs. But the sharing scheme that Zeynep's worked on, I haven't come across it.
What I know is that some of the fertility clinics or egg banks have egg donor schemes that offer egg donors a free egg freezing cycle after they've donated a couple of times. So it's not that you have one cycle and you share the eggs, but that you have a couple of cycles, and then as sort of as a reward for having done, for example, 3 cycles, you get a free egg freezing cycle for yourself. So yeah, that exists in the US. For example, my egg bank offers that.
So I think someone's just commented in the chat actually that their egg bank has that. You can donate 3 and then have 1 on the house.
Yeah.
So thanks to Anna Sussman for letting us know about that. We must have such a knowledgeable audience. It's can sometimes answer the questions. Oh, sorry, she said not mine. My egg bank, the one that Lucy mentioned. So that's my mess up. Sorry about that. Okay. So now the next question is from Michael Jeffries. What is the average annual cost of storage? Now, I don't know whether you've got any data on that, Rachel, from the HFEA perspective. If not, I think I might go to Zeynep.
Cost isn't something that we regulate, so it isn't something that the HFEA would look at particular cost. From an experience from being an embryologist for 25 years, the costs can be variable from a couple of £100. I know in some centres upwards, but Zeynep might have a more accurate information from more recent times.
Zeynep or Lucy?
Yeah, in our study, there were differences. So some clinics would offer particular packages of 3 years of freezing that were cheaper once you froze your eggs with them. But a single year of egg freezing varies in the UK between about £150 and £450. So it's not an inconsequential amount of money.
If I can, what I always find interesting to add to that is in my presentation, and I had to do it very quickly, but I had a list of different costs for egg freezing, the storage costs, and they were quite variable across clinics in the US and as we hear in the UK as well. I come from the Netherlands myself, and there the egg freezing cost is €40 a year. so the cost of keeping your eggs stored. And so it kind of shows the huge variability between the $1,100 that was quoted in some of the New York clinics to the €40 in the Dutch context, where the prices are determined on a national level and are equal for each clinic, which is usually a clinic in a public hospital. So it kind of shows the variation that exists within different health systems.
I think one thing I've heard is women complain that the fees tend to creep up over time as well, which if you're storing them for a long time, all of a sudden you realise that it's now becoming, you know, slightly more significant amount to pay each year. So that might be something else to look at, about thinking whether you sort of have a sort of freeze on the storage fee, because that would give you the sort of certainty of what you're in for. And the next question is from Smitri Bata. Apologies again for my pronunciation, and this is for Rachel. If women 40 years old, fully counselled, sorry, it's quite a difficult question for you to answer, Rachel, as I'm working for the HFEA, sorry about this. But if they're fully counselled about the low chance of success and risks and still want to pursue egg freezing, would you be justified in declining them treatment?
Obviously, from a HFEA point of view, the key would be information provision, counselling, consent, and a decision that's made with a medic who's in that centre. From a practical point of view, obviously, if a patient, say at 40, wants to freeze her eggs, there is a low chance, but that's still a lot lower than somebody approaching a fertility clinic at the age of 44 wanting to use her own eggs. So there is considerations to take into account, the ovarian reserve, the quality, there's lots of things to take into concern before it's a definite no, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to move to the next question because I'm conscious we've got lots building up, and we'll be out of time before we know it. And so this is a question from James Duffy, and he mentions the Nuffield Council on Bioethics report that came out on social egg freezing, and I think someone's posted the link to that on chat, so thanks for that. And the briefing has really had some useful content in about employment benefit and workplace and gender disparities. It expresses concerns about social egg freezing, frustrating improvements to improve family-friendly work environments and family leave and childcare subsidies and all those things that were familiar with people having problems with, and it could increase workplace gender disparities. And so he wants to know what the panel's thoughts are on egg freezing in relation to this and how they could be mitigated. And although he says these questions for Zeynep and Rachel, he actually posted it before everyone else had spoken. So I think that both Eileen and Marcia will have some things to say on this. So I think I'd actually like to go to Eileen first about whether she thinks that it could undermine that sort of the better
Sure.
the political improvements that we need to change the workplace environment for families.
So maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but clearly I'm an investor, and you've noticed how many relationships I've had in my life. So I'm an optimist, but I have a real problem with this, the suggestion or maybe the concern that these points are mutually exclusive. I just don't buy that it's a zero-sum game. You know, or if we think that it is, then we have to change that. Why is it that as women or as people who are looking to start families, whether you're women or men, do we have to choose between, you know, looking for family supportive, you know, policies from our workplace or benefits to help us, you know, improve or increase the length of our fertility? I just don't understand why that would be the case. And so I think there is a world that exists, and it's a perfectly sensible and hopefully practical conversation where no, we can continue pushing for more options, more education, and more access to be able to better manage our own reproductive health, and at the same time have a better workplace that supports working parents that might already have children.
Yeah, Marcia, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, well put, Eileen. I mean, I agree with you too. And I think actually that's the way women feel. You know, in my study, I did these in-depth interviews with all of these very successful professional women, and many of them were happy with their careers. They worked very hard and they had been developing their careers, and, you know, they but at the end of the day, it's like, why can't I have both? I've always, all along, I've been working, I've always been hoping to have a relationship and have a family. And it really wasn't the work that caused me to be in this situation. But now that I'm in this situation, what am I going to do about it? So, I fully believe we've got to improve the situation for women workers, women workers. We see this, especially during the COVID pandemic. It's just been very hard on women. We know that, whatever we can do structurally to help women succeed, it's, great. But I agree with you, this is a reproductive health issue for a lot of women. And so, I believe that technologies are useful when they help to solve reproductive health problems. And I think that's the way women themselves see it. Women who go into egg freezing, see this as something that would help them, especially if they had some financial support to do it. And we need to talk about the cost of it and the profit of it and so forth. But yeah, I agree with you. This isn't an either or, these aren't really in opposition, although they're often posed that way, including by a lot of feminist commentators, I must say. So yeah, that's all I'll say.
So unless any other speakers have got any burning things that they want to add to that, I'll move on. And this is an important comment, but I think it may be something I'll get Zeynep to come back on as well, from Sigal Klipstein, and she says that women should be counselled about the later costs of thawing eggs, fertilising them and transferring them. The initial costs and storage are only part of the package here, of those fees, for the women who will ultimately come back and use them. So Zeynep, I was wondering if in your studies, but maybe not something that you looked at, whether that was sort of linked to women, so that they, it was really made crystal clear that they could be up for another big chunk of cash.
Really, really very seldom. Generally, there was no mention of the aftermath. And of course, there is an assumption, I think, by clinics, because as Marcia says, these clinics do operate in a kind of IVF world, that that this would be common knowledge. If you're getting your eggs frozen, then you would then have to use IVF and have ICSI. And actually, not every woman is necessarily aware of that. So definitely those costs need to be discussed, and also even more importantly, the potential success rates of that need to be discussed, rather than this sort of presentation that makes it look as if you freeze it and then you're done, you've got your security or your insurance, which is not quite the case.
Yeah, great. Does anybody else want to come in on that one? I can see, no, I'm not seeing any.
I was just going to say, Sarah, as well, that ICSI tends to be used, doesn't it, for frozen eggs? So it would be important as well to mention how eggs would need fertilising in the future, and the risks and information provided around that.
Yeah,
it's also good as a later cost to add that oftentimes if that women may decide to have another cycle after the first one. So they may consider the cost of one cycle, but find that if they don't have enough eggs or would like to have some more eggs, they'll do another cycle. So that doubles or triples the first costs as well, beyond the next steps of storing them down the line.
And so the next question is directed to Eileen, and about, this is an anonymous attendee who says, your talk's focused on white collar workers. Are there efforts to make these treatments more accessible to blue collar workers and manual laborers?
Shift workers, for example, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I would hope so. But I think, like we've seen with other types of employer benefits, they seem to start with corporates that are probably competing with what they would describe, highly skilled workers. So they offer these benefits, whether it's, in the facility, gyms, picking up your laundry. These types of benefits that become add-ons seem to start with corporates that are looking at the white collar sort of workforce. I would love, at the same time, again, I don't think it's one or the other, that we should have policy conversations about potentially mandating this across all employers. Again, just like the pension conversation we're here in the UK, any employer with more than 10 employees has to have contributions to employee pensions. I think it would be a fantastic conversation to have with policymakers about pushing fertility benefits as part of healthcare, an overall healthcare package. So I would like to think, yes, we can do both at the same time.
I think the next most popular one isn't so much of a question, more of a statement, really, but that reproductive choices should be combined with the scrutinisation of maternity benefits, and companies should talk about ending discrimination when returning to work. And I think that the points that the panel have been making about these things not being mutually exclusive is sort of valid for that. So I'm going to move on. And an anonymous attendee wants to know, how young can someone be to freeze their eggs? So I think that's going to be a question of it depends, but I'm going to go to Rachel first to cover off on that one. I think Rachel can deal with that one.
Yes, I mean, obviously it's all about consent, isn't it? And when informed consent can be given. And there might be other reasons why it might be under the age of 18, for example, for a medical reason, that can be done in consent with a consenting adult. But from a social point of view, that would be very hard. It would have to have an intensive counselling period if somebody did present at a clinic very young wanting to freeze their eggs.
And I think we also have to differentiate here, don't we, with people freezing for medical reasons when they may be affected by cancer in their teens, or, you know, a bit like in the scenario that Eileen was talking about earlier, but when something could still potentially be done there. So there's that distinction as well to be made. Zeynep, I can see you want to come in.
Yeah, because there was another question later on that sort of related, that talked about ovarian tissue freezing. And for when younger patients need to freeze their or need to protect their fertility for medical reasons, there is now increasing use of ovarian tissue preservation, which seems to be also showing good success rates. It's newer, it's less provided, less often used, but that's certainly used in the cases of younger patients who need, for medical reasons, to protect their fertility.
Great. I'm going to skip down the list a little bit to a question for Eileen from Simon Freeman. And he wants to know, are fertility employee benefits tax-free? Or are they supplied significantly more cheaply than an employee can independently get one with a supplier of choice? Because if not, you know, wouldn't you be better off with higher pay?
Yeah, no, of course. And I think this is something that employers obviously have lots of levers where they can actually make this either more palatable or otherwise for the employees. But yeah, as I understand it, you know, everyone needs to check with their different employer and obviously on the tax code. But as I understand it, benefits above £50 in value are taxable. So yes, that is the case. So funded treatment, employer funded treatment would be taxable, but still you know, employees would save thousands of pounds. And we saw some of the examples of the costs of either egg freezing or egg collection or IVF, for example, because in general with these programs, if they are employer subsidized, employees end up paying about 20 to 40% of the cost. The other point I'd like to make, and I hope that I emphasized it enough when I was talking earlier with my slides, is I'm not, you know, I wasn't just talking about the actual medical treatment itself. Really big, important facet for me is the education, the information, the resources, and the support. And obviously a lot of that can be offered by employers as, you know, genuine benefit, and that wouldn't be taxable, of course.
I'm quite interested, and I'm going to use my chair's prerogative here, about that education piece, because I remember, it's, well, probably 10 years ago now, that we had a relationship with one of the big 5 law firms, and we were like, oh, you know, we were happy to get experts to come in to talk about it wasn't so much about egg freezing then, because it wasn't so widely available, but to talk about, you know, fertility and IVF, etc. And the feedback we got was no, because no woman would want to be seen to be going into the room to be talking about that, because it may then affect, you know, she may perceive, you know, there's a perception that it could affect her career chances because, oh, she's going to be going off on mat leave. I was wondering if you've got anything to say about that. And I can see Zeynep nodding, so I'm going to come to her after you.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, for me, I think I can absolutely see that. And it's been a stigma. And I think I did mention that when I was presenting my slides. I would like to normalize the conversation. And as you mentioned, Sarah, we're a little bit further behind the US in terms of how comfortable people feel having this conversation. And we need to make workplaces a safe environment to have this conversation. But yes, I think part of the education is also informing managers management teams, people, organizations, in terms of how to deliver or make this information available. And maybe it's not a seminar where people physically walk into a conference room and make themselves conspicuous in that way. Maybe there are ways to make it less conspicuous. Maybe it could be remote, maybe it's virtual, and maybe it's giving, contact details to participate in webinars or something that's slightly more private. But yes, there's education at all levels. So not just the content itself, but also in how it's delivered and supported.
Yeah, so maybe now we're all damp handed with Zoom. This is the way forward. Lucy.
Yeah, just to come in on that briefly, I also put in the chat an interesting study that was done recently, speaking with 40 women who are working in companies that sponsor egg freezing and fertility insurance. And it was really interesting because they were appreciative of having that benefit. And at the same time, the analyst and the person doing the study also found that there was very much also an idea of how they can be an ideal worker, and the idea that they could have that child at the wrong time and that would be not beneficial for them or their career. So that idea of timing the pregnancy was more of a difficulty rather than the lack of availability of, say, maternity leave benefits. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. It can sometimes be a bit more intangible and more with company culture than with the specific regulations that are available. So that's something, I found that a really interesting study to read and something to keep in mind when people work in this field, to look at how can we improve that aspect as well.
And Marcia, do you want to add anything on this one from a US perspective?
Yeah, I actually want to say that there were women in our study American women who were activists. I mean, they actually worked hard to get their companies to offer, fertility benefits. I mean, I interviewed with some women who had been in the tech industry and were early on, pushing, and actually in some major reproductive rights organizations as well, women who felt that egg freezing should be part of the panoply of technologies that were offered in major reproductive rights organizations that offer other things. And I also have to say that a lot of women said, I told my male boss, or I told all my male colleagues that I was doing this. Women are opening these conversations. It's not something completely hush hush and stigmatized and secret. Many women talked about, we need to educate men that we're doing this. And, yes, and some people say, yeah, egg freezing can benefit men in a variety of ways. We actually, I think main point of my study is that we need to have men in these conversations. And I'm glad that I think some men are out there in the audience have listened to this, because it's really important. Men are women's reproductive partners in many cases, and they need to be part of these conversations too. And men do have power in workplace settings, and so they need to be part of these conversations. And we need to be talking about why the men are absent in many women's lives, which is a driving factor motivating women to turn to this technology. That's not emphasized enough. Many women in my study said it really had nothing to do with their career that they ended up doing egg freezing. It was really that they just didn't have the right partner. So we need to be talking and including men in these fertility conversations.
No, absolutely. And this gives me the perfect cue to mention my 5 nephews who are all adults, and I, get the lecture regularly from me on this sort of topic, much to their, I suppose, deep sinus is what I get in responses like, here she goes again. Now, the next question is for you, Marcia, actually, and it's, do you think that there's a risk by detaching egg freezing from the rest of the clinic, we could be misleading women and making this a transactional process of banking eggs rather than a medical intervention with attached risks, which is associated with future procedures in order to conceive?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that except to say, I know I'm reflecting the way women felt, that they felt that there wasn't enough differentiation in IVF clinic settings of what they were going through, and therefore they felt that there needed to be some separation, at least that they felt less alone and less stigmatized because of their unpartnered status. And so I understand what that person is, saying, that then it just becomes, it moves into this other realm perhaps of these for-profit egg freezing, clinics, which I think is what Lucy's been focusing on, and the concern about them. Are they doing it just for the, you know, the profit and exploiting women and so forth. So that's not good either, right? But there has to be sort of some happy medium, right, where women who are doing egg freezing feel supported and know the risks and know that this isn't a guaranteed technology. They need to be fully informed of what they're getting into before they undertake it, wherever that happens to be. But I actually do think in America, the rise of these boutique sort of fertility clinics, you know, places like Kind Body and Extend Fertility, and Lucy has all the list of names, they're popping up mostly in major urban centers like New York and in the Bay Area, because they do have savvy women, professional women in those big cities who, honestly, you know, the word that was used over and over was, I was in an assembly line. You know, I felt like a cow in an assembly line in a big IVF clinic. It wasn't comfortable for me. You know, it needs to be a different kind of experience. And I think that those, you know, sort of enterprising egg freezing clinics now are taking advantage of the dissatisfaction that women had with their experiences. And so there has to be some sort of happy medium. Women going through IVF and women going through egg freezing, it should be a better experience wherever it's taking place, right? You know, so I guess that would be my, I've written a lot about the need for patient-centered care for infertile people, for women going through egg freezing. We need to really have high quality reproductive health care offered to women and to men. I work on male infertility too. So patient-centered care is needed everywhere.
And Lucy, did you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting. I think it's just such an interesting development, and I don't know. I wouldn't say that the women who go to those clinics would be exploited or that the clinics are exploitative, but I do think it's really important for people who engage with the fertility industry to know how it functions and how it's organized, and so that you can keep that in mind when you make your decisions about which clinics you go to, and that you can keep that in mind when you look at the material or the information and education that's being offered, so that you can have an even more informed decision that that includes that kind of reflection on the broader social issues, as well as having an awareness of how the industry is organized. And so I think my concern is mostly, I don't know if it's a concern, but I think it's something interesting to look at, to see what different kinds of stories are being told about being fertile, and what different kinds of stories are becoming normal in terms of what the expected course of action is in relation to the concerns that a lot of women have about whether or not they want to conceive, or when they would like to do that, and whether that will be possible for them. So I think it's good to be aware for us of how those stories are changing over time. And I think different players in the industry tell different stories. And so it's good to sort of juxtapose them next to each other.